Good morning. Thank you for joining us this Sunday morning at Colonial Hill Baptist Church. I'm Ernie Armstrong, and it's my privilege to lead in Bible study this morning from Colonial Hill. Today, we continue our study from John's Gospel. We will look at an interesting passage, as almost all of John's Gospel is, that is interesting and so full of material. We're looking at chapter 18, verses 1 through 11. We're going to start off by reading verse 1, which then leads to a confession from me, a confession of an error that I stated in last week's lesson. So let's look at verse 1, chapter 18. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side, there was an olive grove, and he and his disciples went into it. So what's the confession? Well, in last week's lesson, as we studied from chapter 17, and we studied the high priestly prayer of Jesus for his disciples and for us, I said that was Jesus was praying in the presence of and for the disciples there on the Mount of Olives. I was getting ahead of myself because, as I just read, chapter 18 says, when he had finished praying, the praying that he was doing was what we studied last week, the high priestly prayer of Jesus for his disciples and for those believers who would become believers based upon the message that his disciples would continue to give, which would, of course, include the resurrection of Jesus. Those believers include you and me. Well, let's look at this real quickly and begin studying our lesson. The curriculum writers, let's see if I can access my notes quickly. The curriculum writers refer to this lesson as, or entitle this lesson, I am He. I am He. I don't really like that lesson title. I think a better title for our lesson is Jesus in Charge, or Jesus in Control. John's Gospel doesn't contain a lot of the detail and facts that we find in the Synoptic Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke accounts of Jesus' arrest, and that's what chapter 18 is going to be leading us to, the arrest of Jesus just before the trial, the so-called trial, and ultimately the crucifixion. They have different purposes. John is writing his gospel as the last of the Gospels, and so he has access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, their accounts. And so instead, or this is supposition, and quite frankly, supposition on my part, and I have no authority or credentials to be speculating other than my own speculation. John, writing somewhat after them, doesn't see the necessity to repeat what they have already said. Also, as we are going to see in verse 2, the Synoptic Gospels are showing one side of Jesus, the human side, where John's purpose is to show that Jesus, both man and God, is divine. And And we need to keep that in mind as we study John's gospel. His purpose is to show Jesus as the Son of God. That's one of his purposes. Let's note also something that's going to be an undercurrent, not specifically highlighted, and we'll mention this a little bit later on, but let me point it out here. Jesus left with his disciples. What did he leave? I think he's leaving the city, Jerusalem. Some think that may mean he is leaving the upper room where he had been having the Last Supper with his disciples and had been teaching them. I think he had already left that, and I got ahead of myself last week and said he'd gotten all the way into the garden. There are some indications that Jesus may have been teaching with his disciples as they left the upper room where they had the Last Supper and walked to the Mount of Olives. They possibly, this is again some speculation, but there's basis for it, stopped at the temple, the outer courts of the temple, where I think it's conceivable to believe that there Jesus prayed his prayer for the disciples, the high priestly prayer. So he's leaving. Jesus left with his disciples. I think they're leaving the city. I've had the immense privilege to tour Israel and Jerusalem, and to stand on the side of the Mount of Olives to see what could possibly have been the Garden of Gethsemane, but even more, to me, even more impressively, to stand on the Mount of Olives and look across the Kidron Valley to the east wall of the city, the old city of Jerusalem, and just behind it, in today's time, and I attempted to find some of my old photographs so that we might show them, or this aspect of them, in this presentation of the lesson this morning. There is the gold dome of the Muslim temple known as the Dome of the Rock that you can see just over the eastern wall of the old city of Jerusalem and the east gate, where Jesus and his disciples would have come out of. Jerusalem was built upon a hill or hills, and the Mount of Olives is called Mount of Olives because it's on a hill as well. And in between is, and some translations even reference this as the brook of Kidron. One translation says the ravine. They crossed the ravine, the Kidron ravine. So just imagine two hills, Jerusalem on one side, the Mount of Olives on the other side, and in between is a valley, and the Kidron brook, creek, if you will, flows at the bottom of that valley. Another interesting fact is mentioned by several commentators at the Passover. Maybe as many as 250,000 lambs were slaughtered as a sacrifice at Passover. What do you do with all of the blood of these sacrificed lambs? There was a channel built to flow from the temple, which is just inside the east gate of the old city of Jerusalem, down that hill into the Kidron brook or creek, where it then flows on down and out of the area. Several commentaries reference Jesus having to walk across, and his disciples, across the brook, step across it, and there would still be the evidence of the blood of these sacrificed lamb. Jesus, the Lamb of God, who is about to sacrifice himself for you and for me, for our sins. Also, John, there's undercurrents of a reference to David, King David, because it says when David left the city of Jerusalem to avoid the revolt led by his son Absalom, he crossed the Kidron Valley and went over the Mount of Olives and into the wilderness. There are going to be some other references, perhaps, subtle references without saying David's name in John's account. All right, it says going to on the other side there was an olive grove, and he and disciples went into it. Some translations reference a garden. John doesn't name the garden. Matthew chapter 26 identifies it as the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means olive press. It's where the oil was extracted from the olives grown on this hillside. Again, John doesn't mention or reference this detail because he has other purposes in mind. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are showing the human side of Jesus in their accounts. They go into his agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he goes further and he takes Peter, James, and John to go with him to pray for him as he prays to his Father that the cup might pass from him, sweating so profusely it's as if he's sweating drops of blood. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's from those Gospels that we get that type of detail. But John, instead of showing the human side of Jesus, is emphasizing his divinity, his divine side. And so he is going to show us Jesus as someone who is in charge and in control. Plus, John is going to focus on the betrayal that is going to lead Jesus to the cross, and ultimately the crucifixion. Now, the other Gospels also reference Judas identifying Jesus by the kiss on the cheek. John doesn't reference that, as we will see. One of the commentaries I turn to on a regular basis, I don't always draw from it, but there's almost always good material, is material written for Lifeway, who produces our curriculum material, by a pastor down in Angleton, Texas. His name is Sean Thomas. Pastor Thomas says, and his outline, and I'm going to follow at least his outline, but there's some other deviations that I will point to from some of the other commentaries. Pastor Thomas says this is a character, these 11 verses develop or show the character of 4 people. Those are Judas, Jesus, Peter, and Malchus. A very small character, but we'll see the importance if we can get there. Verses 2 and 3 read, "Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden." There's where I was looking for that reference to the garden. John doesn't name it, but the others do, the Garden of Gethsemane. "Guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons." There in verse 2, it tells us Judas knew the place. We're going to be looking at the character of Judas. Verse 3 tells us with it, he's leading or guiding a detachment of Roman officers, or a detachment of Roman soldiers, along with officers from the temple priests as well as some Pharisees. How many? It says, the New International says a detachment. I read from different commentaries the word used, and I can't pronounce it, so let's don't even have me mispronounce it in front of everybody. It could refer to, a detachment could refer to a whole cohort, maybe as many as 1,000 men, or a part of a cohort, as which would be 600 men. Ray Stedman, a theologian of this date, of late 1900s, says he thinks there may be a total of 50 soldiers, priests, and Pharisees being guided by Judas. I think that's makes a whole lot more sense, but we don't know for sure. John's word that the New International translates as detachment is vague enough that we can't, it could be any of those numbers, but it makes more sense to me that he wouldn't bring a whole army of 600 people. Instead, a detachment of 30, along with temple priests or officers of the temple priest, and some Pharisees, maybe totaling another 15 to 20. We've got around 50 people. So what do these verses tell us about Judas? Well, it says that in verse 2 that Jesus betrayed him. Verse 5, which we did not read, but we will in just a moment, says Judas the traitor, which causes me to pause and ask, do you get some sense that John didn't care much for Judas? We mentioned in a lesson a couple of weeks ago, I didn't go back to double check if we did mention it, but was some mention that present day books and even films are portraying Judas as basically a good guy who's just trying to force Jesus to reveal himself and to ascend into power so he could overthrow the Romans. And he did so by this method of appearing to betray Jesus so that Jesus' hand would be forced and he would take control. But John's chapter 12 tells us very emphatically Judas was not a good guy. There in verse 6 of chapter 12, John says he was a thief, and he used to pilfer what had been put into Jesus' money purse or treasury, money that was for the poor. Judas was the keeper of the purse, and John says he would pilfer from it. He would steal from it. Perhaps in part that explains why John didn't think highly of Judas, but obviously his betrayal here, which has been in John's mind since it occurs, further explains his low regard for John. But in discussing Judas, the betrayal, and his status as a traitor, let's go ahead and read verses 4 and 5. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" Verse 5, "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am." Now, most translations say, "I am he," but everything I read said all that's there is the two words, "I am." And probably a interpreter, transcriber put the word "he" in to make it sound like you and I would talk. Jesus was not you and I. He is saying, and John's gospel actually says, I am. Jesus of Nazareth, they replied, I am, Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with them. Now, let's pause for a second and note that there are many of the Psalms containing messianic prophecies, foreshadowing who Jesus would be and what he would experience. One of those, let's look at a couple of these. Psalm 55, verses 12 through 14, 12, 13, and 14, as well as Psalm 41, verse 9. These Psalms having been written by David. Psalm 55, 12 through 14 says, "For it is not an enemy who reproaches me, then I could bear it. Nor is it one who hates me, who has exalted himself against me. Then I could hide myself from him. But it is you, a man my equal, my companion, and my familiar friend. We who had sweet fellowship together walked in the house of God in the throng." Psalm 41, verse 9, David wrote, "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me." First of all, David is writing about a real person. Yes, it has foreshadowing to apply to Jesus. Jesus knows betrayal, but he sees it in one he had selected, one who walked with him for 3 years, Judas. I cannot, this is another name I can't pronounce. I didn't write it. I think I could pronounce it. I'm going to mess it up. I see, I've already messed it up. Ahithophel may have been the father of Bathsheba, but had become a close associate of David, and he betrays David on behalf of David's son, Absalom, who's going to lead the rebellion against David. And thus David wrote Psalm 55 and Psalm 41. But that foreshadows the betrayal that Jesus sees and experiences here. Just another matter he has in common with us. Have you been betrayed by someone close to you? You know, if so, you know how deeply that hurts. We have a Savior who has experienced matters similar to us. Okay, and we've kind of transitioned into Jesus. Jesus stepped forward. We need to note that. Jesus stepped forward. He went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" And when they said, "Jesus of Nazareth," he said, "I am." Verse 6, when Jesus said, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again, he asked them, "Who is it you want?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Verse 8, "I told you that I am." And I'm leaving out the he, which is in most of the translations. Jesus answered, "If you are looking for me, then let these men go." Verse 9, this happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." What are those words that John tells us so that shows that it fulfills what he said? That was in last week's lesson in Jesus' high priestly prayer for his disciples. He prayed to the Father and told the Father, "I have not lost one of those you gave me, except for Judas." And so here it is. These verses show us a great deal about Jesus. One, they show that Jesus is in charge. He was not surprised by Pastor Thomas calls it the ambush. He knew exactly what he was walking into. He had previously said, "The Son of Man has come to give his life as a ransom for many. Just a couple of weeks ago, we saw and studied how many times that Jesus had told his disciples that he was going to be delivered over to the Jewish authorities to be crucified and to die and rise again on the third day. He had even told them there in the upper room at the Lord's Supper that he was going to be betrayed by one of them who was at the meal with him. And of course, that was Judas. We see Jesus taking charge, and there's something important there we're going to touch on. We see Jesus' power. When Jesus said, "Who do you seek?" and they told him, he said, "I am." This is the expression of God's identification of himself. Moses asked God at the burning bush, "Who do I tell them? You're sending me back to my people and to the Egyptians. Who do I tell them has sent me?" And God said, "I am the I am." So Jesus' use of that terminology is his proclamation, his claiming that same identification. Also, Jesus' power. John is showing us Jesus' divine power. He is letting them take him. He's not just some helpless victim here, overcome by a great show of force. He is purposely allowing them to take them. Just like, as we're going to see in the coming weeks, Jesus tells Pilate, as he appears before Pilate, "You would have no authority over me unless it was given to you from above." Pilate was not in charge. The Jews were not in charge. The soldiers right here are not in charge. Judas, the betrayer, the traitor, was not in charge. Jesus was in charge. Let's look real quickly. It's not important, but it's interesting. In verse 6, when Jesus said, "I am," they drew back and fell to the ground. What does that mean? There's, again, some differences of opinion. Some would try to say a natural phenomenon occurred here. People were startled by Jesus' authority and taking charge, and they backed up, and in backing up, they stumbled over themselves and just essentially knocked everyone over. Others say, no, it is the Shekinah power of God that causes them to fall down as the Magi fell down to worship the infant child, as Mary fell down in Jesus' presence at the raising of Lazarus from the grave. Ray Stedman doesn't like that idea. He says Jesus is not involved in Star Wars. He's not holding up his hand like the Jedi and through the Force causing people to fall down. It is more likely that they either backed up and fell down, which was kind of Stedman's concept, or I do think there is something to the idea that they recognize the authority, and the falling down is not falling down over backwards, but instead maybe an initial reaction to being in the presence of God himself and a kneeling. But they quickly stand back up because Jesus asks them again, "Who is it you're looking for?" They tell him Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, "I am." But we also see here Jesus' care for his apostles. As John said in verse 9, that all of this happened so that the words he, Jesus, had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Jesus had been with them and had provided, some say, spiritual protection for them. I think also physical protection. Just as Jesus could have left the garden and gotten away, and he had done so before. Even as the soldiers or the temple police had planned to arrest him there in the city during the Passover week, this preceding week, he just slipped away. He could have done so here, but his hour had come. And he is not going to let it pass, but even so, he is going to protect those that he cares for. That's his apostles, his followers. That's you and I. John 13:1 says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Jesus is going to provide care. I have not lost one. The security of the believer is something we believe in. Jesus is showing some of it now. We conclude with verses 10 and 11. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? I've run us out of time. We've got to conclude quickly, but let me point out what we see from Peter is his impetuousness. Peter had promised or had affirmed or contended that he was willing to die with Christ. I think he sees that as this occasion right here. Jesus had told him, Peter, you're going to deny me 3 times before the rooster crows. And I think Peter is still sort of up to the idea, no, I'm going to prove it. He pulls his sword and swings, and I think he swings somewhat wildly. He was not attempting to cut off anybody's ear. He was probably attempting to strike the head of the servant of the high priest, whose name is Malchus. Malchus is short for Melech, which means king. And the irony of the servant being named king is interesting. But Jesus rebukes Peter, and in essence he says, that's not how I am going to save the world. Not through violence, not through force. I'm going to provide the world with an opportunity to be saved through faith, not through violence. And so, hey, there are all kinds of interesting questions here that we won't get into. Peter is called a fool for this action. By some, he is called brave and ready to defend his master, Jesus. We can all make mistakes, even when we are attempting to defend our master. He doesn't need our defense. He could have called legions of angels to protect him. He was here because his hour had come for him to complete the task that he came for, to die for my sins, for yours as well, on the cross, and then to rise again. Malchus, why is John named Malchus? It is important for us to understand that John is telling us these are real people. You can go verify it. You can talk to people and ask them, do you know a Malchus? Yes, that was the high priest's servant. This is not some made-up, fictitious story, as some accused the apostles and the writers of the Gospels in doing. This was true, real people. It just proves once again that when Jesus is proclaimed, he's real, his mission is real, his salvation is real for you and I, and for those who believe in him, trust in him as the Son of God who died for our sins and rose in victory and sits at the right hand of God and awaits us when it's time for him to return. He awaits us to be with him for eternity. John's gospel is amazing. We have 4 more lessons. I'm looking forward to studying even more John's Gospel. Thank you for joining with us this morning. Good morning.